A Pair of Schoolgirls by Angela Brazil. Chapter 3. A Retrospect. More than 13 years before this story begins, Miss Barbara Sherborne happened to be travelling on the Northern Express from Middleford to Glaceberry. She had chosen a corner of the compartment with her back to the engine, had provided herself with books and papers, had ordered a cup of afternoon tea to be brought from her restaurant car precisely at 4 o'clock, and had put a piece of knitting in her handbag with which to occupy herself in case she grew tired of reading or watching the landscape. After these preparations she anticipated a comfortable journey, and she leaned back in her corner feeling at peace with herself and all the world. Her fellow passengers consisted of two old ladies, evidently returning home after a holiday in the South, a morose-looking man with a bundle of socialist tracts, and a middle-aged woman, who, with a baby on her knee, occupied the opposite corner. Nobody spoke a word, except an occasional necessary one about the opening or closing of a window, and all settled down to read books and papers, or to enjoy the luxury of a snooze while the train sped swiftly northwards. The baby was sleeping peacefully, its lips parted, its long lashes resting on its flushed cheeks, and one little hand flung out from under the white woolly shawl which was wrapped closely round it. It made a pretty picture as it lay thus, and Miss Sherborne's eyes returned again and again to dwell on the soft lines of the chubby neck and dimpled chin. She was fond of studying her fellow creatures, and she could not quite reconcile the appearance of the child with that of the woman who held it in her arms. The latter was plainly though tidily dressed, and did not look like an educated person. There was nothing of refinement in her face, the features were heavy, the mouth even a trifle coarse. Her gloveless hands were work-worn, and her wedding ring was of a cheap gold. The general impression she gave was that of a superior working woman, or the wife of a small tradesman. The baby did not resemble her in the least. It was fair, and pretty, and daintily kept. Its bonnet and coat and the shawl in which it was wrapped were of finest quality, and the tiny boot that lay on the carriage seat was a silk one. Miss Barbara could not help speculating about the pair. She amused herself first with vainly trying to trace a likeness, then with wondering whether the woman were really the mother of the child, and if so, how she managed to dress it so well, and whether she realized that its clothes looked out of keeping with her own attire. Finally she gave up guessing, in sheer despair of arriving at any possible conclusion. The train had been 10 minutes late in starting, and was making up for lost time by an increase in speed as it dashed across a tract of moorland. The oscillation was most marked, and walls and telegraph posts seemed to fly past so quickly as to dazzle the sight. Miss Sherborne closed her eyes. The whirling landscape made her head ache, and the swaying of the carriage had become very unpleasant. She took hold of the strap to steady herself, and was debating whether it would be better to close the rattling window, when, without further warning, there came a sudden and awful crash, the impact of which hurled the baby onto her knee, and telescoped the walls of the compartment. For a few seconds she was stunned with the shock. When she recovered consciousness, she found herself lying on her side under a pile of wreckage, instinctively clutching the little child in her arms. She moved her limbs cautiously, and satisfied herself that she was unhurt. Part of the roof had fallen slantwise, and by so doing had just saved her from injury, pinning her in a corner of the overturned carriage. The smashed window was underneath, about 18 inches above the ground, for the train in toppling over had struck a wall, and lay at an inclined angle. From all around came piteous groans and cries for help, but Miss Sherborne could see nobody, the broken woodwork cutting her off completely from the rest of the compartment. The baby in her arms was screaming with fright. Fortunately for herself, she preserved presence of mind and a resourceful brain. She did not lose her head in this emergency, and her first idea was to find some means of escape. She stretched out her hand and broke away the pieces of shivered glass till the window beneath her was free. Then, still clasping the child, she managed to crawl through the opening onto the line below. So narrow was the space between the ground and the wreckage above her that she was forced to lie flat and writhe herself along. It was a slow and painful progress, and the light was so dim that she could scarcely see, while at any moment she expected to find her way blocked by fallen woodwork. Yet that was her one chance of safety, and at any cost she must persevere. She never knew how far she crawled. To her it seemed miles, though probably it was no greater distance than the length of the carriage, but at last she spied daylight, and, struggling through a hole above her head, she climbed over the ruins of a luggage compartment, and so on to the bank of grass edging the line. The wind was blowing strongly over the moor, so strongly that she had difficulty in keeping her feet as she staggered into the shelter of the wall. The scene before her was one of horror and desolation. She saw at once the cause of the accident. The express had dashed into an advancing train, and the two engines lay smashed by the terrific force of the collision. A few passengers who, like herself, had managed to make their escape stood by the line, some half-dazed and staring helplessly, others already attempting to rescue those who were pinned under the wreckage. The guard, his face livid and streaming with blood, was running to the nearest signal box to notify the disaster, and some labourers were hurrying from a group of cottages near, bringing an axe and a piece of rope. To the end of her life Miss Barbara will never recall without a shudder the pathetic sights she witnessed as the injured were dragged from the splintered carriages. But the worst was yet to come. Almost immediately a cry of fire was raised, and the flames, starting from one of the overturned engines and fanned by the furious wind, gained a fierce hold on the broken woodwork, which flared up and burned like tinder. "Come away!" screamed a countrywoman, seizing Miss Sherborne almost roughly by the arm. "You with a bairn? Bring it to our house yonder out of the wind. The men are doing a they can, and we canna help them. It's no fit sight for women. Come, I tell you the train's naught but a blazin' bonfire, and them as is under it's as good as gone. Don't look. Don't look. Come, "In the Lord's name." "Then may He have mercy on their souls," said Miss Barbara, as with bowed head she allowed herself to be led away. The news of the accident was telegraphed down the line, and as speedily as possible a special train, bearing doctors and nurses, arrived on the spot. The sufferers were carried to the little village of Greenfield, close by, and attended to at once, some who were well enough to travel going on by a relief train, while others who were more seriously injured remained until they could communicate with their friends. The fire, meanwhile, had done its fatal work, and little was left of any of the carriages but heaps of charred ashes. Left of any of the carriages but heaps of charred ashes. Those who had escaped comparatively unhurt had, with the aid of the few farm labourers who were near at the time, worked with frantic and almost superhuman endeavour to rescue any fellow passengers within their reach, but they had at last been driven back by the fury of the flames and forced to abandon their heroic task. No one could even guess the extent of the death roll. From the extreme rapidity with which the fire had taken hold and spread, it was feared that many must have perished under the wreckage, but their names could not be ascertained until the news of the disaster was spread over the country, and their friends reported them as missing. 24 hours later Miss Barbara Sherborne sat in the parlour of the Red Lion Hotel at Greenfield. She had remained there partly because she was suffering greatly from shock, and partly because she felt responsible for the welfare of the little child whom she had been able to save. Rescue was circulated in all the morning papers, so she expected that before long some relation would arrive to claim tea. The woman who had accompanied it was not among the list of the rescued, and Miss Barbara shuddered afresh at the remembrance of the burning carriages. "It's a bonny bairn, too, and takes wonderful notice," said Martha, Miss Sherborne's faithful maid, for whom she had telegraphed. "Those to whom it belongs will be crazy with joy to find it safe. Dear, dear. To think its poor mother has gone, and to such an awful death." The baby girl was indeed the heroine of the hour. The story of her wonderful escape appealed to everybody. Newspaper reporters took snapshots of her, and many people begged to be allowed to see her out of sheer curiosity or interest. So far, though she had been interviewed almost continuously from early morning, not one among the numbers who visited her recognized her in the least. Fortunately she was of a friendly disposition, and though she had had one or two good cries, she seemed fairly content to be nursed by strangers, and took readily to the bottle that was procured for her. At about 6 o'clock Miss Barbara and Martha sat alone with her in the inn parlour. The afternoon train had departed, bearing with it most of yesterday's sufferers and their friends, so it was hardly to be expected that any more visitors would arrive that evening. The baby sat on Miss Barbara's knee, industriously exercising the only two wee teeth it possessed upon an ivory needlecase supplied from Martha's pocket. Outside the light was fading, and rain was beginning to fall, so the bright fire in the grate was the more attractive. "I'm glad we didn't attempt to go home tonight," Martha said Miss Sherborne. "I expect I shall feel better tomorrow, and I shall leave much more comfortably when this little one has been claimed. No doubt somebody will turn up for her in the morning. It's too late for anyone else to come today." "There's a carriage arriving now," replied Martha, rising and going to the window. "Somebody's getting out of it." "Yes, and she's coming in here, too, I verily believe." Martha was not mistaken. A moment afterwards the door was opened, and the landlord obsequiously ushered in a stranger. The lady was young, and handsomely dressed in deep mourning. Her face was fair and pretty, though it showed signs of the strongest agitation. She was deadly pale, her eyes had a strained expression, and her lips twitched nervously. Without a word of introduction or explanation she walked straight to the child, and stood gazing at it with an intensity which it was painful to behold, catching her breath as if speech failed her. "Do you recognize her?" asked Miss Barbara anxiously, turning her nursling so that the light from her lamp fell full on its chubby face. "No. No," gasped the stranger. "I don't know it. I can't tell whose it is in the least." She averted her face as she spoke, her mouth was quivering, and her hands trembled. "You've lost a baby of this age in the accident, maybe?" enquired Martha. "No, I have lost nobody. I only thought, I expected," she spoke wildly, almost hysterically, casting swift, uneasy glances at the child, and as quickly turning away her eyes. "You expected," said Miss Sherborne interrogatively, for the stranger had broken off in the middle of the sentence. "Nothing, nothing at all. I'm sorry to have troubled you. I must go at once, for my carriage is waiting." "Then you don't know he, child?" "I don't," the stranger repeated emphatically, "not in the slightest. I tell you I have never seen it in my life before." She left the room as abruptly as she had entered, without even the civility of a goodbye, addressed a few hurried words in a low tone to the landlord in the hall, then, entering her conveyance, drove off into the rapidly gathering darkness. "There's something queer about her," said Martha, watching the departure over the top of the short window blind. She was ready to take her oath that she'd never set eyes on the child before, but the sight of it sent her crazy. Deny what she may, if you ask me, it's my firm opinion she was telling a lie. "Surely no one would refuse to acknowledge it," exclaimed Miss Barbara. She seemed so terribly agitated and upset, she must have expected to find some other baby, and have been disappointed. "Disappointed?" sniffed Martha scornfully. "Aye, she was disappointed at finding what she expected. Agitated and upset, no doubt, but the trouble was, she knew he poor bairn only too well. In spite of the publicity given by the newspapers, no friends turned up to claim the little girl. Nobody seemed to recognize her, or was able to supply the least clue to her parentage. It was impossible even to ascertain at what station the woman, presumably her mother, had joined the train. She was already settled in the corner when Miss Sherborne entered the compartment, and though a description of her was circulated, none of the porters remembered noticing her particularly. All the carriages had been full, and there had been several other women with young children in the accident. Any luggage containing papers or articles which might have led to her identification had been destroyed in the fire. The baby's clothing was unmarked. Day after day passed, and though many visits were paid and inquiries made, the result was invariably the same, and in a short time popular interest, always fleeting and fickle, died completely away. After staying nearly a fortnight at the Red Lion Hotel, in the hope that the missing relatives might come at last to the scene of the disaster, Miss Sherborne returned to her own home, taking with her the child which so strange a chance had given into her charge. For some months she still made an endeavour to establish its identity. She put advertisements in the newspapers and enlisted the services of the police, but all with no avail, and when a year had passed she realized that her efforts seemed useless. Her friends urged her strongly to send the little foundling to an orphanage, but by that time both she and Martha had grown so fond of it that they could not bear the thought of a parting. "I'll adopt her as my niece, if you're willing to take your share of the trouble," Martha said. Miss Barbara. "Don't call it trouble," returned Martha. "The bairn's the very sunshine of the house, and it would break my heart if she went." "Very well, in future, she's mine. I shall name her Dorothy Greenfield, because Dorothy means a gift of God, and it was at Greenfield that the accident occurred. I feel that fate flung her into my arms that day, and surely meant me to keep her. She was a direct gift, so I accept the responsibility as a solemn charge." Miss Sherborne's decision met with considerable opposition from her relations. "You're quixotic and foolish, Barbara, to think of attempting such a thing," urged her aunt. "It's absurd, at your age, to saddle yourself with a child to bring up. Why, you may wish to get married." "No, no," said Miss Barbara hastily, her thoughts on an old heartache that obstinately refused to accept decent burial. "That will never be, now. You must not take that contingency into consideration at all. You may think differently in a year or two, and it would be cruelty to the child to bring her up as a lady and then hand her over to an institution. I should not do her that injustice. I take her now, and promise to keep her always. But with your small means you really cannot afford it. I am sure I shall be able to manage, and the child herself is sufficient compensation for anything I must sacrifice. She is a companion already." "Well, I don't approve of it," said Aunt Lydia, with disfavor. "If you want companionship, you can always have one of your nieces to stay a week or two with you. It's not the same. They have their own homes and their own parents, and are never anything but visitors at my house. However fond they may be of me, I feel I am only a very secondary consideration in their lives. I can't be content with such crumbs of affection. Little Dorothy seems entirely mine, because she has nobody else in the world to love her. Then you actually intend to assume the full responsibility of her maintenance, and to educate her in your own station, a child sprung from who knows where. Certainly. I shall regard her absolutely as my niece, and I shall never part with her unless someone should come and show a higher right than mine to claim her. Having exhausted all their arguments, Miss Sherborne's relatives gave her up in despair. She was old enough to assert her own will and manage her own affairs, and if she liked to spend a large proportion of her scanty income on bringing up a foundling, well, she need not expect any help from them in the matter. They ignored the child, and never asked it to their houses, refusing to recognize that it had any claim to be treated on an equality with their own children, and disapproving from first to last of the whole proceeding. It was part of Miss Barbara's plan to let little Dorothy grow up in complete ignorance of her strange history. She did not wish her to realize that she was different from other children, or to allow any slight to be cast upon her, or any unkind references made to her dependent position. For this reason she removed into Yorkshire, and settled down at the village of Hereford, where the circumstances of the case were not known, and Dorothy could be received as her niece without question. She left the little girl at home with Martha when she went to stay with her relations, whom she succeeded in influencing so far that she persuaded them to refrain from all allusions to Dorothy's parentage when they paid return visits to Holly Cottage. Dorothy had often wondered why Aunt Lydia and Aunt Constance treated her so stiffly, but, like most children, she divided the world into nice and nasty people, and simply included them in the latter category, without an inkling of the real reason for their coldness. That she was never asked to their homes did not trouble her in the least. She would have regarded such a visit as a penance. Martha kept the secret rigidly. In her blunt, uncompromising fashion she adored the child, and was glad to have her in the house. Though she did not spare scolding, and enforced a rigorous discipline concerning the kitchen regions, she looked after Dorothy's welfare most faithfully, especially during Miss Sherborne's absence, and always took the credit for having a half share in her upbringing. And now more than 13 years had passed away, and the chubby baby had grown into a tall girl who must be verging upon 14. Time, which had brought a line or two to Miss Barbara's face, and a chance grey thread among her brown locks, had also brought her a modest measure of success. She had always possessed a taste for literary work, and in the quiet village of Hereford she had been able to write undisturbed. Her articles, reviews, and short stories appeared in various magazines and papers, and by this method of adding to her income she had been able to send Dorothy to Avondale College. It was quite an easy journey by train from Hereford to Colminster, and the school was considered one of the best in the north of England. The girl had been there for 4 years, and had made satisfactory progress, though she had not shown a decided bent for any special subject. What her future career might be, fate had yet to determine.